Around the figure's feet, smaller paintings showed scenes of abundance. Full hunts, successful harvests, healthy children playing in village squares. But it was the paintings on the opposite wall that made Thomas understand why Elena had been so insistent in her warnings. These showed the same figure, but now it was surrounded by scenes of destruction. Villages burned to the ground, people fleeing in terror, and strangest of all, a great explosion of light that seemed to consume everything in its path. The figure stood at the center of the devastation, but now its posture was different, no longer protective but vengeful, its arms raised as if calling down destruction from above. Thomas had spent enough time in museums and libraries researching his hunting grounds to recognize what he was looking at. This was a record of some kind. A history painted by people who had lived in these mountains long before European settlers arrived. And if the paintings were accurate, they told the story of a guardian spirit that protected the land and its people, but could also destroy both if it was threatened or killed. Just superstition, he muttered to himself. But his voice sounded small and uncertain in the vast chamber. Ancient people trying to explain natural disasters. He was still studying the paintings when he heard it, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the chamber and the tunnels beyond. It was like breathing, but magnified to impossible proportions, as if the mountain itself was drawing air into massive lungs. The sound was rhythmic, steady, and definitely not natural. Thomas raised his rifle and switched off his headlamp, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. He stood perfectly still, controlling his own breathing, listening with the intensity that had made him one of the most successful hunters in the state. The breathing continued, coming closer with each cycle. Whatever was making the sound was moving toward him through one of the tunnels that led deeper into the mountain. Minutes passed like hours. As Thomas waited in the darkness, his military training from decades ago came back to him. Patience, discipline, the ability to remain motionless while prey moved into range. He had used these same skills to take down elk at distances that other hunters would consider impossible. Now he would use them to bag the trophy of a lifetime. The breathing grew louder, and with it came the sound of movement, not footsteps exactly, but something heavy shifting its weight from one limb to another. Thomas could smell it now, the same wild musk he'd detected at the cave entrance, but concentrated to an almost overwhelming degree. His eyes had adjusted enough to make out vague shapes in the darkness, and he could see something massive moving at the entrance to one of the far tunnels. He raised his rifle to his shoulder and switched the headlamp back on. The creature that stood before him was beyond anything his mind could have prepared for. It was humanoid in basic shape but stood nearly 10 feet tall, with shoulders that spanned at least 4 feet across. Its body was covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and its limbs were proportioned like those of a human stretched to impossible dimensions. But it was the face that made Thomas's hands tremble as he tried to aim his weapon. The creature's features were a disturbing mixture of human and animal characteristics. Its eyes were large and intelligent, holding an awareness that was unmistakably sentient but utterly alien to human understanding. Its mouth was filled with teeth that belonged on no earthly creature. Not the fangs of a predator or the grinding teeth of an herbivore, but something designed for purposes Thomas couldn't begin to imagine. For long seconds, hunter and creature stared at each other across the chamber. Thomas had expected to feel the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with lining up a perfect shot, but instead he felt something he'd never experienced while hunting. Doubt. The creature's eyes held an intelligence that seemed to look right through him, judging not just his intentions, but his very soul. The words came from its throat in a voice like grinding stone, but they were recognizably English, though pronounced with an accent older than any human language. "Why have you come to this place, hunter?" Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, but he found himself answering instead of shooting. "I've been tracking you, following your signs. For what purpose?" The question was simple, but Thomas found it impossible to give a simple answer. Why had he followed the tracks? For the trophy? For the thrill of the hunt? For the fame that would come with documenting an unknown species? Standing in this ancient chamber, surrounded by paintings that suggested a history far older and more complex than he'd imagined, all of those motivations seemed suddenly petty. "I hunt," he said finally. "It's what I do." The creature moved closer, each step shaking the ground beneath Thomas's feet. "I know what you do, Thomas Redfield. I have watched your kind for many generations. You take life to prove your dominance over the natural world. You hang the heads of your kills on walls to demonstrate your power to others of your species." The fact that it knew his name should have terrified him, but Thomas found himself oddly calm. It's sport. It's tradition. It's how we connect with our ancestors. Your ancestors knew better, the creature replied. They honored what they killed. They took only what they needed and gave thanks to the spirits of the animals that fed their families. You kill for pleasure and call it tradition. Thomas kept his rifle trained on the creature's chest, knowing that at this range, even a heart shot might not stop something of this size before it could tear him apart. Maybe you're right, but that doesn't change what I am. The creature nodded slowly, as if it had expected this answer. No, it does not. Just as it cannot change what I am. It gestured toward the paintings on the walls. Do you understand what you see here, Hunter? Thomas glanced quickly at the ancient artwork, not wanting to take his eyes off the creature for more than a second. Pictures, stories, mythology.
History,
the creature corrected. These paintings tell the story of my people and yours, of the compact that was made when your ancestors first came to this land. We agreed to share the mountains and the valleys, the forests and the streams. Your kind would hunt and gather and build their lives, and my kind would guard the sacred places and maintain the balance that keeps this world stable. Sacred places? The creature's expression grew sad, an emotion that seemed strange on features so alien yet so familiar. Beneath this mountain lies something your kind would call a nuclear reactor, though it was built by hands that shaped stone before your species learned to use fire. It has provided energy to this region for thousands of years, powering natural processes that keep the earthquakes at bay and the volcanic activity dormant. It is my responsibility to guard it, to ensure that it continues to function properly. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the chamber. You're telling me there's some kind of ancient nuclear power plant under this mountain? Your words are crude but adequate, the creature replied. For generations, my family has maintained the devices that regulate its output, ensuring that it provides energy without causing the kind of catastrophic release that would devastate this entire region. It is a responsibility passed down from parent to child for over 3,000 years. And if something happened to you? The creature's eyes seemed to glow in the reflected light of Thomas's headlamp. If the guardian dies without passing the knowledge to an heir, the regulating systems fail within hours. The energy that has been carefully controlled for millennia is released all at once. It gestured again toward the paintings of destruction. Your people have a word for it. Explosion. Though that term hardly does justice to the scale of devastation that would follow. Thomas found himself lowering his rifle slightly. How big an explosion large enough to level everything within 50 miles of this mountain? Large enough to poison the air and water for decades. Large enough to turn your peaceful valley into a wasteland where nothing will grow for generations to come. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. 50 miles would encompass not just the wilderness areas he knew and loved, but the town where he'd lived his entire life, the ranches and farms that supported thousands of families, the schools where children learned and played, the churches where his friends and neighbors gathered every Sunday. You're lying, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're trying to scare me into backing down. The creature shook its massive head. I gain nothing from deception, Hunter. If you kill me here and now, you will have perhaps 6 hours to flee this region before the explosion occurs. Even then, the radiation will follow the wind patterns and the water systems, carrying death far beyond the initial blast zone. Thomas raised his rifle again, but his hands were shaking now. Then why don't you just leave? Go somewhere else. Let someone else guard this thing. Because it cannot be left unguarded, because the knowledge required to maintain the systems takes decades to learn and can only be passed from one of my kind to another. And because I am the last of my lineage. When I die, the knowledge dies with me. The chamber fell silent, except for the sound of their breathing and a faint humming that Thomas now realized was coming from somewhere deeper in the mountain. The sound of ancient machinery, still functioning after thousands of years, still maintaining the delicate balance that kept unimaginable energies safely contained. Thomas had spent his entire adult life believing that the wilderness existed for him to explore, to conquer, to take from as he pleased. He'd never considered that there might be forces in the natural world that were older and more powerful than human civilization, responsibilities and duties that stretched back to the dawn of time. The creature before him wasn't just an animal to be hunted, it was the last guardian of something that could destroy everything he'd ever known. But he was still Thomas Redfield, and Thomas Redfield had never backed down from a challenge in his life. What if I don't believe you? He asked. What if I think you're just a clever animal trying to save its own hide? The creature's expression grew infinitely sad. Then you will pull that trigger, Hunter. You will claim your trophy and mount my head on your wall next to all the others. And 6 hours later, when the mountain explodes with the force of 100 nuclear weapons, You will have exactly enough time to understand the magnitude of your mistake before the shockwave vaporizes every atom in your body. Thomas felt sweat running down his back despite the coolness of the cave. His finger rested on the trigger of his rifle, and he knew that at this range he couldn't miss. One shot and the hunt would be over. One shot and he would either claim the greatest trophy in hunting history or condemn everyone he'd ever cared about to a horrible death. The creature stood perfectly still, making no attempt to flee or attack. The choice is yours, Thomas Redfield. Choose wisely. Above them, unheard by either hunter or guardian, Elena's voice drifted down from her cabin as she spoke into an old radio, trying to reach someone who might be able to evacuate the valley before it was too late. But the static was heavy, and she wasn't sure her message was getting through. In the town below, people went about their normal Friday evening routines, completely unaware that their lives hung in the balance of one man's decision in a cave deep beneath the mountains. Children played in their yards, families gathered for dinner, and couples made plans for the weekend, all blissfully ignorant of the ancient forces stirring in the darkness above them. Thomas Redfield closed his eyes for just a moment, feeling the weight of his rifle and the weight of the choice before him. When he opened them again, his decision was made. Thomas Redfield squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed through the chamber like thunder, magnified by the stone walls until it became a sustained roar that seemed to shake the very mountain. The creature staggered backward, a dark stain spreading across its chest, but it didn't fall. Instead, it looked down at the wound with something that might have been disappointment, then raised its eyes to meet Thomas's gaze one final time. 6 hours, it whispered, and then collapsed to the cave floor with a sound like a falling tree. For several seconds, Thomas stood frozen in place, his rifle still raised, his mind struggling to process what he'd just done. The creature lay motionless in the beam of his headlamp, its massive form already beginning to cool in the underground air. He'd done it. After 4 days of tracking, he'd finally brought down the greatest trophy of his career. But instead of the satisfaction he'd expected to feel, Thomas found himself overwhelmed by a growing sense of dread. The creature's words echoed in his memory. 6 hours. Had it been telling the truth about the ancient reactor deep beneath the mountain? Or had it simply been an elaborate lie designed to save its own life? The answer came sooner than he'd expected. A low rumbling began somewhere far below, so deep that Thomas felt it in his bones before he actually heard it. The sound grew steadily stronger, and with it came a vibration that made dust rain down from the chamber's ceiling. The paintings on the walls seemed to shimmer and dance in the wavering light, and the air itself began to feel different, thicker, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. Thomas ran to the creature's body and knelt beside it, pressing his ear to its massive chest. Nothing. Whatever it had been, guardian or monster, it was dead. And if its warnings had been true, then he had just condemned everyone in the valley to the same fate. The rumbling grew stronger, and now Thomas could hear other sounds mixed in with it. The groaning of metal under stress, the hiss of escaping steam, and something that sounded like massive gears grinding against each other after eons of smooth operation. The ancient machinery that had maintained the mountain's stability for thousands of years was beginning to fail, just as the creature had predicted. Thomas grabbed his pack and ran for the tunnel that led back to the surface, his headlamp beam dancing wildly as he sprinted through passages that now seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The rumbling followed him, growing louder with each passing second, and he could feel heat beginning to radiate from the stone walls around him. Behind him, in the chamber where he'd made the worst decision of his life, the creature's body began to glow with a soft phosphorescent light. The ancient paintings on the walls flickered and changed, now showing scenes of Thomas himself making his way through the forest, tracking the guardian to its lair, raising his rifle for the fatal shot. The mountain itself was recording these final moments, adding them to the historical record that would survive long after everything else had been reduced to radioactive ash. Thomas reached the cave entrance just as the sun was setting, over the valley below. The rumbling was so loud now that it drowned out every other sound, and he could see lights flickering in the windows of the town as people began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Car alarms were going off as the vibrations triggered their senses, and he could see people standing in their yards looking up at the mountain with expressions of confusion and growing fear. He ran toward his truck, parked nearly a mile away in a grove of pine trees, but he'd only covered half the distance when the first explosion shook the mountain. It wasn't the big one, not yet, but it was powerful enough to knock him off his feet and send a shower of rocks cascading down the steep slopes above him. Steam began pouring from fissures in the mountainside, and the very air seemed to crackle with energy. Thomas reached his truck and started the engine, with hands that shook so badly he could barely turn the key. The radio was crackling with emergency broadcasts as local authorities tried to make sense of the seismic activity that was registering on instruments hundreds of miles away. But they had no way of knowing what was really happening. No understanding that they were witnessing the death throes of technology that predated human civilization. As he drove down the winding mountain road, Thomas tried to calculate how much time had passed since he pulled the trigger. 20 minutes? 30, at most. If the creature had been telling the truth, he had less than 5.5 hours to get as far away from the mountain as possible before the main explosion occurred. But he couldn't just run, not when thousands of innocent people were sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that death was racing toward them at the speed of sound. Thomas grabbed the radio microphone and began broadcasting on the emergency frequency, trying to warn anyone who would listen. "This is Thomas Redfield," he shouted over the static and the growing rumble from the mountain behind him. "There's going to be a massive explosion in the Bitterroot Range within the next 5 hours. Everyone needs to evacuate the entire valley immediately. I repeat, everyone needs to evacuate now." The response was immediate but not encouraging. Other voices broke in over his transmission, demanding to know who he was and what authority he had for making such claims. The sheriff's department wanted him to report to the station for questioning. The Forest Service accused him of causing a public panic. Nobody believed him, and why should they? He was just a local hunter with a reputation for tall tales, claiming that a mountain was about to explode based on the word of a creature that shouldn't exist. Thomas reached the main highway and turned toward town, pressing the accelerator to the floor. If he couldn't convince the authorities over the radio, he'd have to do it in person. Maybe if he told them about the creature, about the cave and the ancient paintings and the machinery he'd heard grinding to a halt deep beneath the mountain, someone would listen. But as he raced through the outskirts of town, Thomas could see that his warnings had already had some effect. Traffic was heavier than normal for a Friday evening, with cars loaded down with belongings heading away from the mountains. Word was spreading despite the official skepticism, and at least some people were taking his warning seriously enough to pack up their families and leave. He pulled into the parking lot of the sheriff's station just as another explosion rocked the mountain behind him. This one was bigger than the first, visible as a flash of light against the darkening sky, and the shockwave that followed shattered windows throughout the town. Car alarms wailed in a discordant chorus, and Thomas could hear people screaming in the distance. Sheriff Mike Brennan was waiting for him at the front door of the station, his face grim and his hand resting on the butt of his service weapon. Thomas had known Mike since they were kids, had gone to school with him and hunted with him on dozens of occasions. If anyone would believe him, it would be Mike. "Tommy, what the hell is going on up there?" Mike demanded as Thomas climbed out of his truck. "Half the town is calling in reports of earthquakes, and the other half is trying to evacuate because of some crazy radio transmission about an explosion." Thomas grabbed his friend by the shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. "Mike, I need you to listen to me very carefully. There's something under that mountain, some kind of ancient nuclear reactor, and it's going to explode within the next 4.5 hours. We need to evacuate everyone in a 50-mile radius right now." Mike stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas could see him struggling to process the information. They'd been friends for over 40 years, and Mike knew him well enough to know when he was lying. But the story he was telling was so incredible, so far outside the realm of normal experience, that believing it required a leap of faith that few people were prepared to make. "Tommy, you're talking about evacuating 3 counties. Do you have any idea what that would involve? The manpower, the logistics, the panic it would cause? I can't order something like that without proof, without some kind of evidence that—" His words were cut off by the loudest explosion yet, this one so powerful that it knocked both men to the ground. The lights went out throughout the town as power lines snapped, and in the distance they could see a pillar of fire rising from the mountainside like a biblical plague. Mike pulled himself to his feet and reached for his radio. "This is Sheriff Brennan. I'm declaring a county-wide emergency. All units begin immediate evacuation procedures for the entire Bitterroot Valley. Use any means necessary to get people moving away from the mountains." Thomas felt a moment of relief, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task ahead of them. Even if every police officer, firefighter, and emergency worker in the region dropped what they were doing and focused on evacuation, there was no way they could move everyone to safety in the time they had left. Too many people would refuse to leave their homes. Too many would demand explanations that couldn't be given. Too many would simply move too slowly to outrun the destruction that was coming. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of desperate activity. Thomas drove through neighborhood after neighborhood, pounding on doors and shouting warnings to anyone who would listen. Some people heeded his advice and began loading their cars with whatever they could carry. Others dismissed him as a drunk or a lunatic and slammed their doors in his face. By midnight, perhaps half the population of the valley was on the road, fleeing towards distant cities and relative safety. But half wasn't enough. Elena found him just after 1 in the morning, as he was trying to convince a family with 3 young children to abandon their farmhouse and drive toward the state capital. The old woman appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, her white hair loose around her shoulders and her dark eyes reflecting the glow from the burning mountain. "It's too late," she said simply. "The cascade failure has begun. Nothing can stop it now." Thomas looked up at the mountain, which was now crowned with flames and sending pillars of smoke high into the night sky. "How long do we have?"
Eleanor consulted a pocket watch that looked older than she did.
"Perhaps 2 hours, maybe less. The final containment barriers are failing faster than expected." "What about you?" Thomas asked. "Are you evacuating?" The old woman smiled sadly. "This is my home, Hunter. My family has lived in these mountains for 7 generations. If they're going to die tonight, then I'll die with them." Thomas understood. He'd lived his entire life in this valley, had learned to hunt and fish in these streams and forests, had built his reputation and his identity around his mastery of this particular piece of wilderness. The thought of fleeing to some distant city and starting over at his age seemed almost worse than staying and facing whatever was coming. But as he watched a young mother loading her children into a minivan, her face streaked with tears as she tried to explain why they had to leave their home behind, Thomas realized that his choice had been made the moment he squeezed the trigger. He had killed the Guardian, and now he had a responsibility to save as many people as possible from the consequences of that action. He spent the next hour racing from house to house, farm to farm, using his knowledge of the back roads and hidden properties to find people that the official evacuation efforts had missed. An elderly couple living in a cabin 5 miles from the nearest road. A family of survivalists who distrusted any government warning and had to be physically convinced to leave. A group of teenagers camping in the woods, completely unaware that their weekend adventure had become a race against time. By 3 in the morning, Thomas had done everything he could. The mountain was now a pillar of fire, visible from 50 miles away, and the ground shook constantly with smaller explosions as ancient systems failed one after another. Most of the population had fled, though he knew that thousands had refused to leave or had been unable to evacuate in time. He drove to the highest hill in the valley and parked his truck facing the mountain. If he was going to die, he wanted to see it coming. He wanted to witness the full magnitude of the destruction he had unleashed with a single bullet fired in a moment of stubborn pride. At 3:47 a.m., the mountain exploded. The blast was visible from 3 states, a flash of light brighter than the sun that turned night into day for just an instant before the shockwave followed. The sound was beyond description, not just noise, but a physical force that shattered windows 300 miles away and registered on seismographs around the world. Thomas Redfield had time for exactly one thought before the wave of superheated plasma reached his position. The old woman had been right about everything. The explosion that destroyed the Bitterroot Valley on that October night in 1987 was officially blamed on a previously unknown geological fault that triggered a massive natural gas eruption. The death toll was listed as 847 people, though the true number was probably much higher, since many bodies were never found. The contaminated zone was declared a federal disaster area and remains off-limits to civilian access even today. But in classified government files, sealed away from public view, there are reports that tell a different story. Reports of unusual radiation signatures that don't match any known natural phenomenon. Reports of a blast crater that shows signs of having been caused by technology beyond current human capability. Reports of ancient cave paintings found in the few accessible areas of the contaminated zone, paintings that seem to depict the explosion with impossible accuracy. And buried deepest of all, in files marked with security classifications that most government officials don't even know exist, is the testimony of Elena Vasquez, the only known survivor found within the blast zone. She was discovered 3 days after the explosion, sitting calmly in the ruins of what had once been her cabin, completely unharmed despite being less than 10 miles from ground zero. Her official statement, given to federal investigators who specialized in unexplained phenomena, was brief but disturbing. The Guardian is dead, and the ancient compact is broken. What sleeps beneath other mountains will now begin to stir. What happened here was just the beginning. She died of apparent old age less than a week later, though medical examiners noted that her body showed signs of being far older than any human had a right to be. Her personal effects included journals written in languages that linguistic experts couldn't identify and maps showing locations of similar guardian sites throughout the western United States. The journals and maps disappeared from federal custody within 24 hours of Elena's death, and the agents responsible for securing them reported no memory of ever having seen such materials. In the years since the Bitterroot incident, as it came to be known in classified circles, there have been 17 similar explosions in remote areas of the American West. Each has been officially attributed to natural causes. Each has created a contaminated zone that remains off-limits to public access, and each has been preceded by reports from local hunters of unusual tracks and encounters with creatures that shouldn't exist. The truth about what Thomas Redfield unleashed that night in 1987 remains buried beneath layers of government secrecy and public disbelief. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, people living near the contaminated zones report hearing sounds that seem to come from deep underground. Sounds like breathing, like something vast and ancient beginning to stir after eons of sleep. The guardians are gone, and what they were guarding is finally free. Some warnings should never be ignored. In the remote wilderness of Montana, where ancient forests hold secrets older than civilization itself, one man's obsession with the perfect hunt would unleash something that defied every law of nature. What started as a simple hunting expedition in the fall of 1987 became a nightmare that would change an entire county forever. The old woman's desperate pleas echoed through the mountains. "I'm warning you, stop!" But Thomas Redfield was a man who had never backed down from anything in his life. He should have listened. What happened next wasn't just a story about one hunter's fatal mistake. It was about the ancient forces that still roam our world, waiting in the shadows of forgotten places, and what occurs when modern arrogance meets primal power. The explosion that followed wasn't just physical, it tore through the very fabric of reality itself, leaving behind questions that science still cannot answer. This is the true account of the Redfield incident, a story so extraordinary that the government buried it for decades. Until now. Thomas Redfield had been hunting these mountains for 37 years, and he had never encountered anything he couldn't track, corner, and claim as his prize. At 52 years old, his weathered hands could still draw a bowstring with the precision of a surgeon, and his steel-grey eyes could spot movement in thick brush from 200 yards away. The walls of his cabin were lined with trophies that told the story of his life. Elk, deer, bear, mountain lion, and even a wolf he'd taken during a harsh winter when the pack had grown too bold near the town. This autumn, something was hunting him back. It started with the footprints. Not animal tracks, but something else entirely. They appeared overnight around his campsite in the Bitterroot Mountains, pressed deep into the soft earth near his tent. The prints were roughly human in shape, but stretched nearly 18 inches from heel to toe, with what looked like claw marks extending beyond where toes should end. Thomas had crouched beside them in the pale morning light, running his calloused fingers along the edges of the impressions. The depth suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds, maybe more. He'd been camping in these same woods since he was 15 years old, first with his father and uncle, later alone after they'd both passed on. He knew every game trail, every water source, every cave and rocky outcrop for 20 miles in any direction. Never, in all those decades, had he seen tracks like these. The logical part of his mind suggested bear, but the shape was all wrong. Bears left distinctive pad marks and claw impressions, and they walked differently, with a rolling gait that left a characteristic pattern in the dirt. These prints were methodical, purposeful, almost human in their spacing and direction. They circled his campsite 3 times before disappearing into the rocky terrain that led higher up the mountain. Thomas spent that first day following the trail, his compound bow slung across his back, and his father's old Remington rifle loaded and ready in his hands. The tracks led him through terrain that grew increasingly difficult, up slopes covered with loose shale, and through stands of pine so thick that noon looked like twilight beneath their branches. Twice he lost the trail completely, only to pick it up again hours later near a stream, or in a patch of bare earth between the trees. As evening approached, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Instead of returning to his truck and driving back to civilization, Thomas decided to stay. Whatever was making these tracks, it was unlike anything he'd encountered, and that made it the ultimate prize. The thought of mounting an unknown creature's head on his wall, of being the first person to document something new, filled him with the same excitement he'd felt on his very first hunt all those years ago. He set up a new camp higher on the mountain, choosing a spot with good visibility in all directions and his back against a solid rock face. The night passed without incident, but when morning came, the tracks were there again. This time they came even closer, stopping just 10 feet from where he'd slept. In the soft dirt near his sleeping bag, Thomas found something that made his blood run cold. A handprint. Not human, but close enough to be unsettling. 5 fingers but too long and ending in points that had gouged the earth. The second day of tracking led him into territory he'd only visited once before, years ago when he was younger and more adventurous. The old-timers in town called it the Devil's Backbone, a series of jagged ridges and deep valleys, where the trees grew in twisted shapes and the wildlife seemed unusually scarce. His grandfather had told him stories about this place. Tales passed down from the original settlers about things that walked upright in the darkness, and sounds that carried on the wind like human voices, but spoke no human language. As a practical man, Thomas had always dismissed such stories as superstition and folklore. But now, following tracks that shouldn't exist, into a place where even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, he found himself remembering every word the old man had spoken. It was on the third day that he met her. Thomas had been following a game trail that wound through a grove of aspen trees when he heard the sound of chopping wood echoing through the forest. The rhythmic thok-thok-thok seemed out of place in the wilderness, and he approached cautiously, using the trees as cover. What he found was a small cabin, so well hidden among the pines that he might have walked past it a dozen times without noticing. The cabin was ancient, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a silver-grey color. Moss grew thick on the north-facing walls, and the roof was covered with pine needles and fallen branches. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and beside the front door, an elderly woman was splitting firewood with practiced efficiency. She was small and thin, with long white hair braided down her back and skin that looked like old leather. Her clothes were homespun and practical. A wool dress dyed deep blue, a leather apron, and boots that had been repaired so many times they were more patched than original material. When she saw Thomas approaching through the trees, she stopped her work and watched him with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge he couldn't begin to fathom. "You're the one following the tracks," she said without preamble, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. It might have been European, or perhaps Native American, or something older than either. Thomas stepped into the clearing, keeping his rifle ready, but not obviously threatening. "Yes, ma'am. I'm tracking something unusual. Seen anything strange in these parts lately?" The woman set down her axe and wiped her hands on her apron. Strange is a word city folk use for things they don't understand. "Out here, we just call it life." She gestured toward the cabin. "You look thirsty. Coffee's hot." Against his better judgment, Thomas accepted her invitation. The interior of the cabin was dim and cluttered with the accumulations of a lifetime. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and shelves lined the walls, filled with jars containing things he didn't want to identify. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke and something else. Something wild and earthy that reminded him of the deep forest floor. The woman introduced herself as Elena, though she offered no last name. As she poured coffee from a battered pot into 2 mismatched cups, she spoke in the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "The creature you're following has been in these mountains longer than the trees. Longer than the rocks, some say. My grandmother's grandmother knew stories about it, and her grandmother before that. It's not an animal hunter. It's something else entirely." Thomas accepted the coffee, which was bitter and strong enough to wake the dead. What kind of something else? Eleanor settled into a rocking chair that had been worn smooth by decades of use. The old stories say it was here when the first people came across the great ice. It watched them settle and hunt and build their lives, and mostly it left them alone. But every generation someone would get too curious, venture too far into its territory, and then... She made a gesture like an explosion with her weathered hands. "You're talking about Bigfoot," Thomas said with a slight smile. "I've heard all the stories. Seen the blurry photographs and the plaster casts of fake footprints. Whatever's out there, it's real and it's flesh and blood. Which means it can be hunted." The old woman's expression grew serious. "I'm warning you, hunter. Stop this pursuit while you still can. What you're tracking isn't just dangerous to you, it's dangerous to everyone in the valley below. There are forces in these mountains that are better left undisturbed." Thomas finished his coffee and stood to leave. "I appreciate the hospitality, ma'am, and I respect your beliefs. But I've been hunting these woods for most of my life, and I've never met anything I couldn't handle." Elena rose from her chair with the fluid grace of someone much younger than her apparent years. "That's exactly what the last hunter said 43 years ago. They found pieces of him scattered across 3 counties, and the thing he was hunting disappeared into the deep places for 2 generations. Until now." "What makes you think it's back?" The old woman walked to one of her shelves and retrieved a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. She opened it to a page covered with careful handwriting and what looked like pressed flowers and leaves. Because the signs are all here again. The animals fleeing to lower ground. The trees growing wrong. The way the wind carries sounds it shouldn't. She looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than one lifetime could account for. And because foolish men always think they're the first to be clever enough to catch what can't be caught. Thomas thanked her for the coffee and headed for the door. But Elena's voice stopped him before he could leave. If you won't listen to reason, at least listen to this. It's not just a creature you're hunting. It's a guardian of something ancient and sacred. Kill it, and you'll unleash forces that will make your hunting expedition look like a child's game. He turned back to face her. What kind of forces? Elena closed the journal and clutched it to her chest. The kind that sleep deep in the earth until they're awakened. The kind that explode outward when their guardian falls, seeking new territory, new hunting grounds. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The kind that will turn your quiet little county into a wasteland where nothing good can grow for 100 years. Thomas left the cabin with Elena's warnings echoing in his mind, but his determination remained unchanged. If anything, her mysterious claims only made the hunt more appealing. Whatever was out there, whatever it was guarding, it would soon join the other trophies on his wall. He had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, those trophies would be scattered atoms floating on a radioactive wind that would poison the air for 50 miles in every direction. That night, as Thomas made camp in a sheltered ravine, the footprints appeared again. But this time, they didn't just circle his camp. This time, they led directly to a cave system he'd never noticed before, hidden behind a curtain of fallen rocks and twisted trees. The entrance was large enough for a man to walk through upright, and from its depths came a sound like wind moving through vast underground chambers. Thomas checked his equipment one final time. Rifle loaded, bow strung, enough supplies for 3 days. Tomorrow, he would enter that cave and end this hunt once and for all. He had no idea that deep beneath the mountain, something older than human civilization was stirring in response to his presence. The last entry in Thomas Redfield's journal, found weeks later in the ruins of what had once been a peaceful valley, contained only 5 words. It's not what I expected. Elena, watching from her cabin window as the hunter's campfire flickered in the distance, whispered a prayer in a language that had been old when the pyramids were young. She had done everything she could to warn him. Now, all she could do was prepare for what was coming. In the depths of the cave, ancient eyes opened for the first time in 4 decades, and somewhere far below, the earth began to tremble. Thomas Redfield entered the cave at first light, his headlamp cutting through the darkness like a sword through black velvet. The entrance was larger than it had appeared from outside, easily 20 feet wide and nearly as tall, with smooth walls that showed no signs of natural formation. Someone or something had carved this passage through solid rock, but the tool marks were unlike anything he'd seen before. Long, curved gouges that looked almost like claw marks magnified to impossible size. The air inside was warm and humid, carrying scents that reminded him of deep earth and growing things, but underneath lay something else, something that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was the smell of a predator's den, thick with the musk of a creature that had claimed this territory as its own for longer than Thomas could imagine. His boots echoed against the stone floor as he moved deeper into the mountain, following a passage that sloped gradually downward. The walls were decorated with markings that might have been natural formations, or might have been something more deliberate, spirals and angular patterns that seemed to shift in the dancing light of his headlamp. Every few hundred yards, the tunnel branched off into smaller passages, but Thomas stayed on the main path, following the tracks that had led him here. After walking for nearly an hour, he emerged into a vast underground chamber that took his breath away. His light could barely reach the ceiling, which arched high above like the inside of a cathedral. The walls were covered with paintings that made his blood run cold, crude but unmistakable depictions of creatures that walked upright but were clearly not human. Hunting scenes that showed them pursuing animals he didn't recognize, and strangest of all, images of what looked like people bowing down before a massive figure that dominated the far wall. The figure was painted in earth tones and what might have been blood, standing easily 12 feet tall, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. Its face was a mixture of human and animal features, with eyes that seemed to follow Thomas as he moved his light across the ancient artwork. "I'm warning you, stop," she begged. But the hunter pressed on, and the county exploded.